Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. In light of the ongoing conflict in West Asia, we will be discussing today the interests and strategies of Beijing. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning, in her regular press conference, had opposed the US and Israel launching military strikes against Iran in violation of international law and urged that the parties resolve issues through political and diplomatic means. So, discuss this China's stance further and its interest, I have with me today Anushka Saxena, Staff Research Analyst at the Takshashila Institution, to help us understand both the impact of the conflict on China and the strategies that it could use to turn the tides in its favor. Welcome, Anushka.
Thank you so much, Bhumika. Pleasure to be here.
Right. So, Anushka, before we dive into the details, could you please help us understand the wider regional context? This includes Chinese interests in the West Asian region, and what does US involvement in the region mean for China?
Right. Thank you so much for that, Bhumika. So, if we zoom out and take a step back to look at how China has engaged with West Asia, it is mostly a bunch of economic and technological deals. And by economic, I essentially mean oil for infrastructure sort of deals. And on the technological front, what I'm basically referring to is any investment that comes in through the flagship Belt and Road Initiative, and that can lead to the development of anything from rail and road to fiber optic cable network, right? And so essentially, the Chinese see their stakes in the region as one where they can be the providers of certain benefits and in exchange can have certain leverages of their own. So it's a mutual benefit kind of a relationship that the Chinese have built with Gulf economies. And the way PRC deals always, or Beijing deals always, is that they are not afraid of engaging with the actor, whichever actor it may be, that leads or dominates a certain group or a country, right? And they want to make sure that their interests, which are largely, again, like I said, economic, are met, which is why they also trade with Israel, they also trade with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they also massively trade with, of course, Iran. In fact, with Iran, they say it's a comprehensive strategic partnership. In 2021, they signed the agreement on establishing a CSP, and that agreement sort of promised that there is a potential for a $400 billion trade between the two sides, which can be fulfilled sometime soon in the next few decades, right? And of course, in exchange, the Chinese got really lucrative oil deals from Iran. And up until February 28, 2026, when the US attack on Iran and the counterstrikes from Iran started, 13%, approximately 13% of China's oil and petroleum or hydrocarbon imports were coming in from Iran. And the rest, approximately 55%, 55 to 60, and estimates differ on this, but that's broadly the number, have come in from Gulf countries, from West Asia via the Strait of Hormuz. So if we zoom back in and look at just the conflict and its implications for China and China's relations with the actors involved, look clearly from a narrative perspective, it bodes well that the foreign ministry spokesperson Mao Ning goes out to the media, boasts about answering 11 questions in one press conference which pertain to Iran, and critiques the US and Israel's actions vis-a-vis Iran. But it has a really tightrope to walk here. You know, we really have to scratch the surface and look beneath at the dilemma the Chinese are facing. On the one hand, because of their ties with Iran and because of what Iran was able to offer to them in terms of hydrocarbons and oil, they have to express support for Tehran's indomitable resolve and firm action against the US and Israel, right? They also have to do that because if we look at it from the strategic perspective, China's foreign policy is absolutely tinted with the hues of its competition with the US, right? But at the same time, any more spread, let me put it this way, and spillover of conflict directly impacts direct Chinese investments and strategy in West Asia, because that same Tehran that it is appreciating for its firm resolve and counter strikes is actually attacking Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and the likes, where in lump sum, in the Gulf states in lump sum, Chinese Belt and Road investment supersedes approximately 40 billion US dollars. Might be much more, maybe 50 to 60 as well, if we look at the latest figures sometime soon. We're talking 1 million Chinese expatriates, and a majority of which are just in the United Arab Emirates. And we're talking, of course, exposure to oil trade, exposure to the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking insurance for Chinese ships. We're talking things like there goes around a rumor that the IRGC has said that no Chinese vessel passing the Strait of Hormuz will be attacked. So now vessels from other countries are pretending to be bearing the flag of the People's Republic, and they're getting attacked nonetheless. So the Chinese are concerned. Is the lie worse, or is it worse that they said they were Chinese and they still got attacked? Right? Till such a time, and I'll conclude with this, till such a time as the Iran war is serving the purpose of draining American resources in West Asia, keeping one more aircraft carrier battle group or one more fighter jet or one more naval vessel tied or bogged down rather to the Strait of Hormuz and to the region, it is okay. But suddenly, if it becomes about decimating the Gulf and a war that will last even after all of the US and Israel's targets are achieved, I think that is the kind of spillover, and I will argue that that is the kind of spillover that the Chinese do not want. Now, as to their diplomatic response and what they might do about this, we can get into it in the nick of the conversation.
Right. So thank you, Anushka, for laying out that context really well. And that was also something that I want to understand, wherein you explained the economic interests of China in the region. And we've also seen how China has tried to keep the peace in the region with the Saudi Arabia and Iran peace deal that came up. So we know how much China is involved and what it has at stake in this conflict, right? So, given the stakes that China has, do you think that China will support Iran in its defense, either directly or indirectly, in this conflict?
Right. I think that is the $1 million question, isn't it? Because actually, maybe around the first week of March, I would have said probably not. I would have said definitely not. But now I will say, and pardon me for giving it away, now I would say probably not. Because, firstly, let's look at defense relations China and Iran have had so far. Because of all the international embargoes on Iran, the fact that there are, of course, UNSC sanctions following the breakdown of JCPOA, the UK and the US brought the snapback mechanism in action, by which unilaterally all of the five JCPOA countries could impose sanctions on Iran. Of course, China and Russia haven't done it, but the UK, the US, Germany have. Then, of course, the UNSC sanctions are more formal, but there are also individual country sanctions. And what these sanctions essentially say are, of course, there are some from Australia and Canada as well. What these sanctions essentially mean for exporting countries or countries trading with Iran is that you cannot export to them dual use components or components that are material that goes into defense. So as a consequence, these arms embargoes and these dual use embargoes have made it very difficult for the Chinese to export anything directly to Iran, unlike what they have done with Pakistan. Again, and this is something we talk about at Takshashila often, Iran's biggest failure perhaps seems to be that they were unable to build the nuclear bomb. I'm not saying that if they were able to, it would have prevented some conflict, but the nuclear overhang definitely places an upper limit to the extent to which a conflict can go. And the point I'm again making here is that the Chinese particularly did not help them with the bomb, which they could have done in a beg, borrow, steal fashion, clandestinely, so on and so forth, right? In fact, the Chinese were signatories to the JCPOA until, of course, it broke down in 2018. But even after that, the Chinese did not help them. So, in that sense, I think we can believe Beijing when it says that they've been relatively responsible in officially not associating with Tehran's defense. But what they have done indirectly, and which is what matters here largely, is that they have supplied whatever they could in terms of a few weapon systems, and not just to the IRGC, but also to the Houthis. Now, the Houthi weapon system sales are unconfirmed, but we do know that certain Chinese firms, telecom firms, have been in conversation with the Houthis to give them satellite access via Peitu, which is the satellite navigation system of the Chinese, the Peito, right? Now, this has been going on since 2021. And what it can effectively do is it can help Iran and its proxies in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf to figure out what the state of some US warship or some Israeli tanker is. And that geolocation, of course, is a big intelligence help that the Chinese seem to be providing to the Iran and to the Iranians and their proxies. Then, in terms of direct weapon sales to Iran, what seems to be confirmed is ground based air defense and radar systems. So, there is the HQ-9 that the Chinese have sold to the Iranians. There is the YLC radar that is supposed to be an anti stealth radar. So, an F-35 should have seemingly not been able to find an Iranian target and kill it. Same with HQ-9P, it's supposed to have solid interceptors. And yet, even if these are confirmed and even if these were used, they were too little too late. And neither could they prevent the decapitation of a lot of important Iranian actors, nor could they secure Iran in its position. And Iran, for the longest time, did not want to rely on completely on Russian imports, but it ultimately, what it has been using are the S-400s that it has gotten from the Russians, especially in its air campaign. So, and of course, then there are clandestine reports from Reuters exclusively, which talk about the CM-302 anti-submarine missile being sold from the Chinese to the Iranians. This is one arms export that the Chinese have not just shied away from talking about, but also gone on in public and said that we actively refute that there's a sale like this going on. And yet, whoever in the Reuters office is confident about it, right? So, we're yet to see where this goes. But to the big question of whether China will come to Iran's defense. Now, look, China's approach so far has been to try and play mediator. In fact, many of us saw it coming. They went all in. They appointed a quote unquote special envoy for mediation in the Middle East. So far, we do not know what that envoy has been up to, but it's not a lot of peacemaking. Maybe but the mediation process is difficult, so let's give the Chinese some breathing room. But in terms of what they can do for Iran, I think they are not interested in defending Iran to the T and make sure that it survives as a nation state. What they do want is that their economic interests or their security interests in the region are secured, and the US doesn't go away with a booming victory. Of course, whoever comes out at the end of a regime change in Tehran, Beijing will deal with them openly. But Beijing is likely to support the Iranians, unofficially or indirectly, insofar as they still have some fight and resolve left, that they don't necessarily disrupt Chinese economic gains and interests, but they don't fight so badly that the US eventually succeeds and it becomes another 20-year war. So again, like I said, it's a tightrope walk for the Chinese, which is why I say that probably it's not going to be official defense or officially making a case of Beijing coming to defend Tehran and making sure that it wins this war, but it will definitely be indirect and enough to make sure that the US doesn't, quote unquote, win this war.
No, right. So that also helps us understand, right, the arms sales that you mentioned, and also the balancing act that China will try to play in this conflict. And I think the level of resilience that the Chinese have been able to achieve for the energy security also has a role to play in it. Because if there was lesser diversification in their energy supply, I think they would have had no option but to involve themselves more directly in the conflict. But then, Anushka, I remember you had made this argument, and in the beginning of this op-ed as well, in the beginning of this podcast as well, where you mentioned that China benefits from the US-Iran friction, but current conflict does not serve its interests, and we sort of went through that before in this podcast. So, given that, China's stance and the role that it might play on the, what do you think China's stance and the role would be on the diplomatic front, not just within the region, but also on how would it utilize its position in the international organizations? Also, what would be the best case scenario for China in this war? And how do you think China will use its influence to push the developments in that direction?
Right. So I think first, if I may, weigh in a little bit on the point about energy diversification and China's oil trade. I think if you look at some of the latest numbers, China is losing 1.2 million barrels of oil per day, either to attacks or to just unavailability, right?
Mhm.
And I think, yes, for the Chinese, the 13% that came in from Iran is not much compared to the 40% that comes directly from the Russians. And of course, the Chinese have not backed down on importing oil from Russia despite sanctions and so on. And I think the Chinese must be patting themselves on the back, because now the Americans are going out and telling the Indians that please buy from Russia for a month or whatever, till such a time as oil markets resume to stability. So a major source for China is, of course, the 40-45% import from Russia of oil. Then we have 13% that comes in from Iran. But again, I wouldn't necessarily say that the diversification does not cause them concerns, because, like I said, there is still 50-55% that comes in from the Gulf. I know this mustn't exactly be 100 in what I've said so far, but nearabouts, right? So essentially, I think the Chinese are worried. They're definitely losing quantity today, and they do consume a lot of hydrocarbon for their industrial base, right?
Mm.
Which is massive. They're not the manufacturing powerhouse of the world for safe keeps, right? So I think they would be worried about that, and whatever they're able to get through Hormuz using diplomacy, they are. But what they're unable to, they will either have to service from Russia or from Iran in exchange for certain defense or economic concessions, which I think is a very real possibility, because Iran would want a certain amount of funds to service its war. The Chinese would want their oil demand met. So it could be a win-win, a sort of a win-win that we see the Chinese proposing to Tehran going forward. Now, on the question of what we see China's role would likely be diplomatically, and how do we see it shaping the conflict in the way that it wants it to go. Now, there are 3-4 reasons here why the Chinese would want to intervene, in addition to the economic stakes and the oil market stability and the broader strategic goals of keeping the US bogged down, making sure that the US doesn't expand its presence in the Indo-Pacific. There are also important aspects that pertain to Chinese nationals being in many of these countries, right? In fact, there was the death of a Chinese citizen in Iran when the conflict started in early March. And as a result, the Chinese were deeply concerned, as would be anyone. Even India carries out massive diaspora evacuation operations, because that is one thing that matters. Then the other thing is that I don't think the Chinese are particularly concerned about regime collapse, because whoever comes in, they will find a way to deal with them. So given all of these stakes and circumstances, I think the first thing, of course, like I said, diplomatically, the Chinese are going to make sure that their special envoy does what he can. I think the name of the envoy is Chai Chun. He has some experience also dealing with the 2023 rapprochement that the Chinese wanted to stake a claim in. Of course, Saudi or some other actors at the time that were parties to the rapprochement said that actually all the back channel had happened in Qatar and Oman, and the Chinese just swept in the last minute. But yeah, essentially the Chinese want to take that mediation effort and say that today also we can achieve something like that. So I think Special Envoy Chai Chun's activities, I think he's in Abu Dhabi and Dubai right now as we speak. He's touring there. So let's see how that goes. But essentially, I think the idea is going to be that the Chinese get all the JCPO actors, JCPOA, pardon me, actors back on the table and use some IAEA based inspection reports or some UNSC reports on whether Iran is actually building the nuclear weapon or not, because that is what Trump started this war based on, the assertion that the Iranians, pardon me, possess nuclear weapons. So the Chinese in any negotiations going forward will likely focus on proving that the Iranians don't have any intent or capability to possess nuclear weapons. Because insofar as it was just the breakdown of JCPOA, it was okay. But now it's war, right? So you have to go back to the drawing board and convince all the actors that, the IAEA inspected Iranian facilities. They found nothing. But, the Americans said, no, there's a secret facility that the IAEA doesn't have access to. So this back and forth is something that the Chinese would want to intervene in and make sure that there is no miscommunication. Of course, this is not to say that it will eventually lead to the end of the war or the US acceding. That will likely happen because US resources would be wasted at one point and it would seem futile to the administrators in charge. But the Chinese can at least seek concessions on sanctions, on insurance for the ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and of course for investments in the Gulf states. So removing West Asia as a whole from the line of sight of the Iranians. So these would be things that the Chinese would likely demand. Then, of course, I talked about Chinese expatriates, and there is also a humanitarian aspect to it, because if you look at the numbers from February 28th to today, which is 18th March, approximately 15 tankers and ships from as many as 7-8 countries have been sunk or have been attacked or injured or broken or destroyed in the Strait of Hormuz. And these are civilian commercial ships, right? So that is not good. And of course, when this is the situation, insurers sitting in London do not want to give money for war damages to these ships that are crossing Hormuz, right? Because they can cover act of God in the insurance document, but they can't cover act of war. So essentially, from the humanitarian perspective, I'm guessing the Chinese would want to announce aid packages to Iran, to Bahrain, to Oman, Kuwait. Again, these are economic incentives that make sure that the governments in these economies still remain friendly with the Chinese. It has already termed itself a responsible global power. And I think one of the tools that it's going to deploy to this front is going to be aid and humanitarian facilitation. In fact, I'm assuming, and I don't have the numbers on this, but I'm assuming that PLA Navy and Coast Guard vessels or the task force that the Chinese operate in the Gulf of Aden, I think it was on its 46th or 47th round recently, that would have likely engaged, that would have already started likely engaging in humanitarian operations till now. And then finally, and this is where I'll conclude, I think on the UN front, the Chinese are going to deploy tactics that we've already seen. It's going to be about either condemning the US, a resolution condemning the actions of the US and Israel vis-a-vis Iran, and asking all parties to, bring a cessation of hostilities immediately, or it's going to be abstaining from a resolution that condemns Iran, right? And Russia is likely going to follow a similar strategy. Beyond that, I don't see the Chinese mobilizing the UN for stuff like peacekeeping or some other sort of, some UNSC mechanisms for sanctions revocation. I don't see the Chinese doing any of that, but I definitely see strong worded resolutions, which are very much so in the ambit and comparative advantage of the UN, but nothing beyond that, right? So I think broadly, this is what I see happening. But again, the events of the world have recently shown us that the tide can turn much too many ways, and we can wake up tomorrow and the Chinese can say that we're sending PLA troops on the ground, but today we can only make assessments that are based on reason, logic, and our understanding of China. And till then, it seems like not only will the Chinese give out limited responses, I think they also realize that they only have limited stakes and intent and capabilities in the West Asian region. And that's all I have for you.
That was quite comprehensive, Anushka. It covered, I would say, from international organizations to aid to the tools that China can actually use in the conflict. But yes, so those were all my questions for you. And thank you for this detailed analysis that you gave us. And I hope the listeners also enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for more. Thank you, Anushka.
Thank you, Bhumika, and thank you to our listeners.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.